So, Riot introduced the Vastaya, a race of humanoid magical creatures that have lots of sub-races, species, and their own cultures. The focus of the Vastayan release is on two champions, Rakan and Xayah. But did you notice that they have the same champion spotlight video length? Yeah. Anyway, we get the information of the Vastayan race from a writer known as Edward Santangelo. Wait, hang on.
Santangelo.
No, wait, but I think that since it's a name, it should be Santa and Angelo, so Santangelo, right? Anyway, we get the information from that writer, and he's probably dead by now, so rest in peace. Thanks for the info. Vastayan people came from Ionian humans running away from something called a Great Void War that went to a spiritual or celestial tribe known as the Vastaya Shai. They got personal and tada! Vastaya have many sub-races, but the three most popular kinds of sub-races are the ones like Xayah, Rakan, and Nami, looking more human than animal, ones like Rengar, who looks like animal standing on 2 feet, and ones like Nidalee, who can shapeshift, the latter having the least pure blood. Now, the theories I'm about to present require us to go back in history a bit, back when something called the Rune Wars took place. So every now and then, world runes appear in Runeterra. Notice the name, Rune and Terra, Terra meaning Earth, the Rune Earth, final subtitle. These runes are supposed to grant great power, almost infinite. Seeing how ancient people describe them as Maker's Might, imagine having a god's power at your hand, what would that lead to? Conflict, of course, which ultimately leads to war, hence the Rune Wars. When speaking about League gods, who comes to mind? No, not the gameplay gods. I'm talking about the actual god champion in the game. Aurelian Sol is seemingly the creator of the universe that Runeterra exists in, but with his pride growing stronger and getting the better of him, he went down to the lesser beings, to Mount Targon, who looked at him with fear and awe, and presented him with a crown as well as gave him his name, Aurelian Sol, which supposedly translates to Golden Sun. But then it turned out that the crown was actually a way to control him, and he was forced to do the bidding of the people of Targon, until after centuries passed he felt the power that held him weakening. He felt the powers that bound him arguing, some of them even going into complete and ominous silence. Now this part can be explained with the Lunari tribe getting exterminated by the Solari tribe, you know, the ominous silence. Diana's parents were, in fact, the last of that Lunari tribe, but they both fell dead as soon as she was born. When she later discovered the Lunari and was called a heretic by the elders of the Solari, she burned the place to the ground and escaped to Ionia. Leona, after learning about this, hunted Diana up to Mount Targon, where she learned the true way of the sun. She learned that the sun and the moon should work together, so she set out to find Diana. Now what do these lines mean exactly? When comparing the sun and the moon, the sunlight is obviously much brighter. Thus, the word sometimes used to describe it is blindingly bright, which is quite literal in this case, since the Solari were blinded by the sun's overwhelming light that they abandoned the moon. The irony in this happening is that the light emitted from the moon is the same light which comes from the sun, except in a more pure and gentle form. But now again, when you think of the sun, which place first comes to mind? Of course, the desert. The desert is the place with the harshest sunlight, and so Shurima. After being risen, Shurima's sun disk now hangs over the city gloriously, while an ascended Azir rules it. Shurima in its greatest days spawned throughout the whole continent, well, almost the whole continent, which means it's not unreasonable to think that Mount Targon, that's even more ancient, had connections to it. Aurelian Sol described ascended beings as kittens trying to walk upright. The meaning behind this phrase is a mere mortal trying to pose as a god after getting a mere grain of a god's power. Speaking of gods again, who comes to mind? Nagakabouros, Illaoi's god. When Aurelian Sol taunts Illaoi, he says the following:
"You do not understand your god, Illaoi."
Keyword here being your, meaning it might not actually be a god and equal to Sol, but rather a force of nature, born from the unfulfilled human desires, since Illaoi apparently thinks that Nagakabouros wants people to follow their desires, live in the moment since life is short and all, but what if it was simply born from the people's unfulfilled desires and miserable lives after the multiple Rune Wars took place? In Aurelian's story, we get a glimpse at an interaction with the Voidborn, When Aurelian investigates the Void Rift, he hears the voices behind the rift laughing for some reason, which he takes as an insult, of course, since this space dragon ain't taking shit from no one. The being that resides behind the rift, though, makes Aurelian wary of it. Imagine a gigantic dragon who brought matter into existence actually being wary of something. What exactly could be there in that rift? That brings us to our next point. Malzahar, who is a Shuriman, went into Icathia, where he saw a void rift that enchanted his eyes and broke his sanity. He then emerged from the rift as a prophet of the void, with Kog'Maw coming along with him. Another small detail here, the void's crest is basically the Voidborn coming out of the Icathian crest. And speaking of Icathia, Rise also happened to go there in the past in order to remove 2 world runes that were ignited there. When he arrived though, his master Tyrus, who he admired a lot, was already corrupted by the runes and Rise had to kill him. The world runes invite people to possess them, sort of like the precious ring. So if 1 rune can give a mortal godlike powers, what would 2 runes do? Warp reality, warp dimensions perhaps, open a portal to another plane of existence? When Malzahar arrived in Icathia, the Void Gate was already there, open and spawning creatures. Now here's a question. When you look at the normal universe, or let's say the more human-like universe, the one Runeterra resides in, what do you think the main purpose of its living beings is? It's of course to evolve further and adapt to changes, and that's how the human race has lived so far. But the Voidborn are different. Their living way is more consume and adapt. They are driven by their desire to consume. If you noticed, each Void champion has a desire to consume, whether it's to sate hunger, evolve further, sate curiosity, or just grow. It's always been the desire to consume that drives them. If we're looking for things to describe the Voidborn, it's best to look at the most talkative and smart one out of them, Vel'Koz. In Vel'Koz's quotes, he says quite a few interesting things.
Have they ceased to evolve?
Hinting that the Voidborn evolve much faster than the creatures of this universe.
Intriguing reaction to pain.
Hinting that some, if not all Voidborn, probably react differently to pain, perhaps by laughing.
Ah, the void. I miss the darkness.
This quote drives you to believe that the void is pitch darkness, but then he continues with,
The light here is harsh.
Keyword being here, hinting that there is light in the void, just much more faint. So in Aurelian Sol's lore, the laugh that he heard from the rift might have actually been a cry of pain or fear. Speaking of the Voidborn, it's also revealed that their names are all ancient Shuriman, the first part of the name being their unique name, or the second part being the race name. So for example, Kha'Zix, his unique name is Ka, or at least part of his unique name, and his race's name is Zix. So if Aurelian Sol created this universe, isn't it normal to figure out that another god created the Voidborn universe? Since we were talking about Shurima earlier, did you notice how most of the Voidborn settled in Shurima? You'd think since the sunlight should be harsh for them, they'd rather be in the Kumungu jungle, rather than go into a place that puts them at a disadvantage, right? But does it really put them at a disadvantage? Do you remember what I explained about how the Solari were convinced the Lunari were heretics? The reason behind that being the blinding light of the sun. The sunlight isn't pure, it's polluted with all sorts of energies. That was what drove the people to turn away from the moon. Even Leona herself was dead set on finding Diana and stabbing her to death, until she saw the true light of the sun after climbing Mount Targon. Now since we brought up the sun, let's go into the deep sea, where a certain Vastayan used to live. Nami belongs to the Marai tribe, who every now and then need to replace a moonstone in the depths of the Guardian Sea to drive certain horrific creatures from the bottom of the sea. Now one would normally think that the creatures mentioned are the Voidborn, your typical Runeterra villain aliens, but no. It has never been confirmed that the creatures they fight back are Voidborn. Instead, we get to read that Nami did not find Diana at the usual meeting place where their ancestors met to exchange the moonstone, because Diana was branded heretic and escaped to Ionia, and while that was happening, a certain fisherman was in Guardian Sea with his mates. While they were going through the sea, They encountered a certain black oozing liquid that none of them could identify. When the said fisherman touched the oozing liquid, it dragged him into the sea. He grabbed by the anchor in desperation and drowned into the sea. When next he woke up, he became this guy. So here's a theory. World runes are spawned in each plane of existence. After people fight over them and get consumed by them, they destroy their worlds. But the desire of said people does not end there. They seek a path to cross into other, still pure universes and corrupt them as well. The way the Voidborn and that oozing black liquid that the Marai are trying to block are getting into this universe. The way anything touching the Void Rift gets corrupted, including Malzahar, Kha'Zix, and even the Rift Scuttler. Think about it. The laughter that might as well be cries of pain, the immense desire to consume, the infections. It's like a spreading disease, like some alien zombie apocalypse. So going back to the subject of the Voidborn being in Shurima, and the Moonstone being the only way to block out the horrific creatures in the sea. What if the way to block out the Void creatures and the creatures from the sea is the same one? What if the Shuriman sun isn't bad for the Voidborn, but it's actually good? Sure, it's bright, but it's filled with other polluting energies. Think of it this way. The sun is the stream of energy, and the moon is the purifier, taking the energy, filtering out the bad in it, and making it pure. If you pay attention to Diana's Lunari mark, it's actually not just a full moon in the middle, but an eclipse, as you can see the orange sun rays from the sides. And maybe that's exactly what the purified moonlight is, an eclipse's light. And since Voidborn have ancient Shurima names, that is a direct proof that they first appeared in the long-forgotten ancient Shurima, way before Azir was even born, probably even before Nasus and Renekton were born. And since the Shuriman people did not have a natural way to cause an eclipse, they made the sun disk, a huge disk that blocks out the sun in order for the pure rays of light to burn the Voidborn. Look at the way it's positioned on the stand. Looks familiar? But there's still more. Going into the frozen fields of the Freljord, we get mentions of gods known as the Watchers. The Watchers created the Iceborn out of the Freljordian people, giving them immortality as well as demigod-like powers, in exchange for ruling over them. Now not even Lysandra, the only Iceborn left, knows where the Watchers came from. But the whole act of granting immortality, or extremely long age in this case, as well as godlike abilities, seems a bit familiar, doesn't it? Shuriman Ascension and the birth of Iceborn seem awfully familiar. The shapeshifting, the armor, the abilities, the immortality. But the difference being, if Ascension takes its power from the sun, then where do the Watchers get their strength? It is hugely implied that yordles back in the day had giant and powerful ancestors, but that seemed to have quickly died in their blood over time, replacing strength with brains and intelligence, seeing how Nar can only transform when enraged, and the other yordles can't even come close to doing it. The drawings of Nar show him fighting a huge creature, which closely resembles the Watchers. But keep in mind that since the Watchers fell, and since Lysandra was buried in ice, and since Nar was also frozen in ice, a lot of time has passed, in which we have no idea what happened. So isn't it possible to think that, just like yordles, the Watchers evolved over time after they were driven back and taken over by the Iceborn? Look at their appearance, pure white fur, one horn on each side. Doesn't it remind you of something? Take the features and make the creature much smaller and you got yourself a Poro. It's incredibly silly when you think about it, but then again, yordles evolved into cute small beings, but they weren't going extinct, so they had more room to evolve. It does sound quite impossible that the main mascot of League of Legends is an old god, but Poros are mentioned to be indestructible, so it's plausible to think that just how yordles exchanged strength for brains, Watchers did that with power for durability. But that's enough about the mascots. Let's speak about the old gods themselves. Seeing how we have no actual idea where the Watchers came from, it's quite possible that they also warped into this world through a rune. Perhaps the Watchers themselves were a mere powerless race like humans who acquired the power of the world runes that spawned in their universe, then proceeded to destroy their own universe because of Rune Wars, and moved to this one as the few survivors. And as soon as they arrived, they established themselves as gods by giving the people something to respect them and follow them for. Ascension, though similar to the Iceborn, is a bit different. Ascended beings take after people's beliefs, as explained in one of my older theories. As the sun disk that fuels their power was built by the people, it will answer to the people's hearts, to what they believe in. So perhaps the whole act of whether a person is worthy or not is decided on how the people feel about said person. Now, things that are confirmed or just slightly hinted at are the existence of gods. Aurelian Sol, the god of this universe, the void gods that were laughing through the rift, and possibly the other black creatures that come from the Guardian Sea. As well as the ones mentioned in the beginning of this video. The Vastaya Shai-Rei, who were a celestial race residing in Ionia, but then again we have no actual idea where they came from, do we? The Vastaya Shai-Rei introduced themselves with said name, meaning that they, themselves, recognized the name as their own, which is quite obvious, but then again, look at the way their name is written. Doesn't it remind you of anything? The only thing we know of this race is that they are extremely ancient and that they shapeshift. But guess what also happens to be extremely ancient? Ancient Shurima, whose ascended champions also happen to shapeshift once ascended, taking on the forms of animals. Now a question in the Vastaya Q&A goes as follows. Are all shapeshifting champions Vastaya? And the answer given is that no, ascended champions, for example, are not of Vastayan origin or magic. And that is just how it should be. Ascended champions are not made with the same magic, but seeing how ancient Shurima was expanding everywhere, it might be very possible that they met with the Vastaya Shai-Rei and exchanged cultures with them. Perhaps it was the Vastaya Shai-Rei's shapeshifting ability that inspired ancient Shuriman people to make Ascension a shapeshifting ritual. And perhaps the Shuriman were the ones to give the Vastaya Shai-Rei their name. Seeing as it's in ancient Shuriman, we have no actual idea what most of the words mean. But the word itself looks familiar to the other Shuriman names. Notice that not only the Voidborn were given names with an apostrophe. But the Vastaya Shai-Rei aren't gods. They are merely spiritual beings. Their existence explains Shen's spiritual sword and Kindred's wolf's existence. After all, balance and death apply to the spiritual world just as much as they apply to the physical world. As for the most unexplained creature, the black liquid that turned Nautilus into what he is today, perhaps once Riot updates Nocturne's lore and voice, we'll get a better explanation on what that is. Since the current Nocturne's background and quotes are false, with the whole summoners thing being removed and all. I have no idea how this video turned from a Vastayan lore to a theory explaining gods. But I hope you enjoyed it. If this theory got your gears spinning, give me your best comments below. Bye!